Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Joe, Liz, for arranging this meeting today. It's fantastic to see you all here. There's so much more interest in the questions surrounding aging today, social and emotional aspects of aging, than there was 20 and certainly 30 years ago. And that's probably a good thing for the reasons Susan just outlined. we might have a larger literature that we have to critically analyze. I am going to revisit the phrase, the paradox of aging, which was a phrase that really emerged about 30 years ago to describe the surprise that people experienced when they observed that older people weren't more likely to be clinically depressed and anxious and fearful than younger and middle-aged people. It seemed to be hard to possibly believe, given all the well-documented losses that do occur with age. Before I go any farther, though, I want to say thank you to the National Institute on Aging for supporting this work from the very beginning. None of this would happen with this research that you'll hear me mention, and much of it throughout the day would not exist without the support of NIA. Liz Nielsen, Lisa Unken, John King have been instrumental in not only supporting the work and advocating for it, but really helping to intellectually shape the work and challenge the findings and bring people together like we are being brought together today to critically think about the findings before us. So with that said, let me go back to 30 years ago. When I was in graduate school, I was studying clinical psychology. I thought I needed to, if I was going to study aging, you needed to be a clinical psychologist because old people, you know, they were in real trouble. So there were textbooks on psychopathology at the time. When I was studying, they would have a chapter on depression, a chapter on anxiety, a chapter on phobias, and then they would have a chapter on old age. It was one of the categories. It was a whole chapter. The widespread belief was that older people were very depressed and very fearful, certainly lonely. If we flash forward in a similar way to what Susan was doing for us a few minutes ago, it turns out that almost everything we believed about aging at the time was wrong. And in fact, today there's very good evidence that older people are emotionally balanced, they're slower to anger, more likely to forgive, more likely to experience gratitude, and on and on and on. We see many very positive aspects of aging. So let me show you some of the evidence that has appeared over the years. This is a survey asking a representative sample of Americans whether they experience serious psychological distress. This is just a CDC survey. And they find that older people report less distress in day-to-day life than middle-aged and also younger people. This was preceded, by the way, and I think a real pivotal change point for us in the field were the epidemiological catchment area studies, which set out to interview people in different regions of the country, representative samples of people of different ages, to actually do diagnostic interviews and assess depression, anxiety, and so on. The expectation was they'd find what we thought we would find at the time, and again, they found lower levels. A lot of what they came from the ECA studies looks just like this. You just see less, basically everything except Alzheimer's disease in older adults. But the headlines and the studies kept appearing. Dan Rochek was one of the first people to report that older people were faring better emotionally, and his study more positive and less negative than younger and middle-aged people. And these findings continue to appear, and they continue to make headlines, and again, it's because of the disbelief that this could possibly be the case. Let me just make an observation here that I think one of the best things that can happen in a science is when people don't believe your findings. Because you have to critically go at them again and again. And trying to find out how we're wrong brings us closer to understanding what may actually represent some form of truth. The Economist began doing surveys of life satisfaction. And what they find is a U-shaped curve, but again, with older people faring better than any other age group, reporting higher levels of satisfaction with life. And I'll go through these very fast because Susan already showed you. These are findings from a Gallup poll that Art Stone and his colleagues conducted in a cross-sectional study of people 18 to 85. Stress, you see lower levels. Worry, lower levels in older adults. Anger, so all the negative emotions are being reported at lower rates by older people than younger people. In my group, as some of you know, because some of you have been in my group over the years, thank goodness, we decided that we really needed a longitudinal study to look at this question because almost all the studies are cross-sectional. And it continued to be the case that the greatest generation perhaps was, and is and always was the greatest generation. That is, these are cohort differences, not individual differences. But again, as Susan mentioned, when we look at the literature over time, we see these similar kinds of patterns. And in this longitudinal study, so these are now longitudinal findings across a 15-year period, where we've modeled growth curves, again, from people 18 to 94 at the beginning and followed them over time. And you see within individual change. So it's not just a single generation, it appears, but rather that this is something relatively consistent. Socio-emotional selectivity theory was really created to address this paradox of aging years ago. It is a theory that maintains that the reason we see these kinds of age differences with age is because goals change as a function of perceived time horizons. In humans, goals are always set in temporal context, so if goals change with age systematically, and they do, we may see other kinds of changes. And according to the theory, in youth, when time seems to stretch infinitely into the future, people pursue different kinds of goals than when time is constrained. When time is perceived as nearly unlimited, people are open to exploration, to meeting new people, to expanding horizons. And when time is perceived as constrained in some way, people prepare less for the future and focus more on the present, and under those temporal conditions are more likely to pursue goals about emotional meaning and emotional satisfaction. This theory argues that both of these goals operate throughout life. It's not that old people don't care about learning and young people don't care about emotion, they do. But rather, when these two sets of goals compete, one is more likely to win at different ages. Younger people are more likely to sacrifice emotional well-being to learn, and older people are more likely to prioritize emotional meaning and perhaps let new opportunities to learn go by the wayside. One of the things we spent a lot of time with over the years is to look at social selection. And what we see is that social networks get smaller over age. This is the same sample as the emotion experience sampling study I just showed you is based on. Tammy English and I looked at social networks. So we know that emotional well-being is getting better with age in this group, but social networks are getting smaller. The red line is the total size of the social network. The purple line are people in your network who aren't all that close, and the green line are people in your network who are very close. We've observed this in other studies as well, from the Berlin Aging study and an older sample, but what you see here is that networks get smaller, but that inner circle, people who are very close to you, is maintained at roughly the same size as it is throughout adulthood, so we see those kinds of changes. It looks like when you interact with other people the least, you're doing best emotionally. I mean, that may be a paradox of aging. I did pay these people not to let me just talk as long as I could, but I was only joking. I just want to let you know that. So do remind me, and I will move quickly through this. But let me say a couple more words about selection before you tell me I have to stop. We think at this time, and when I say we, I'm talking about Tamara Sims and Tammy English, Susan Charles, have been looking at the data on emotion regulation and emotion well-being. Because a lot of people have commented, and I'm sure I'm among them, that older people must be regulating their emotions better in order to achieve these levels of well-being. But in psychology, when you talk about emotion regulation, we tend to think about experimental studies where we bring people in the laboratory, we induce emotion, and then we tell them something about how they should regulate those emotions. And as I look at that literature, there's not a lot of evidence that older people regulate better than younger people. In some studies, they do better on some types of regulation. In other studies, they don't do as well with other kinds of mechanisms. If you look at the literature and just sort of zoom out, I think it looks like when you leave people, older people, alone and let them do what they will naturally or what they choose to do to regulate, they do better than younger people. And when you ask them deliberately, I want you to reappraise this cognitively, and I want you to think about that, do this, then they don't do quite as well. That looks like it is to me. So left to their own devices, it looks like older people may regulate better. But again, there's not overwhelming evidence even for that claim, I would say. We think the way people are regulated better is something we would call antecedent emotion regulation, and it comes back to this selection effect. That is, or phenomenon, I should say. We think older people do better in day-to-day life because they're more careful, they're more highly selective in what they do and who they spend time with, so that the activities change. It's the best form of emotion regulation there is, because you don't have to experience the negative emotion that then you have to regulate. You avoid it. I had a conversation with Paul Ekman a couple of months ago, and we were talking about social selection, and he started smiling at one point and reminded me of a conversation he'd had with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was about talking about feeling good and not feeling anger, and Paul Ekman said, yeah, but what about if you're in a situation where you have to? Like, what if you're about to go into a room and you know the audience is really hostile to everything that you believe in? What do you do to prepare yourself? And he said, the Dalai Lama looked at him and said, I don't go in. I think that may have a real, there may really be something to that. So years ago, Susan Charles, Mara Mather, and I began to look at something now called the positivity effect. Instead of social selection, we think there may be a form of cognitive selection that occurs as people grow older too. That is, that they're more focused on positive information in the world, positive material, than negative, which may be good for emotional well-being. We don't see it as coping. We don't see it in response to the negative, but rather it's goal-directed behavior. If you wake up in the morning and your tendency and your motives are about seeing the silver linings, the bright side of life, then you're more likely to look at what's positive and less at what's negative. That's how we think about it. And over the years now, we've conducted a number of studies, and I know many of you have also in other labs, looking at the positivity effect, as it's now called. And we do see differences in people's attention to and memory for positive information over negative. So if you show people images like the ones you see here, some negative, some positive, older people are more likely to remember the positive images than the negative images in studies like this. A recent meta-analysis by Andy Reid, Larry Chan, and Joe Michaels, and analyzed over 100 studies looking at the positivity effect and find reliable evidence for it in the literature. And importantly, where there is less evidence for the positivity effect is in studies where participants are instructed to pursue specific kinds of goals. They're told, I want you to remember everything you can about X or Y. You don't see the positivity effect. Mara Mather has shown that in dual attention tasks, you don't see the positivity effect. That people with the highest levels of executive function are more likely to show it than people with lower levels of executive function. Those findings all suggest that there's something about goal-directed behavior. They're consistent with that kind of an approach. I'm going to skip these. We've looked at neural activation and anticipation of gains and losses. We find that older people's brains activate very similarly in anticipatory reward paradigms than younger people on gain trials, but on loss trials, they're showing very little neural activation. And in the last 5 years or so, my group, led by Nana Nautoff and others, have begun to look at ways that we could use this kind of information to improve behavioral functioning and health. Nana Nautoff, in part of her dissertation, showed that when you give older adults positive messages about the benefits of walking as compared to tell them about the risks of not walking, you see increases in walking in the gain condition, but not in the loss condition. And I'll leave you with a set of findings that we've just produced and we can't explain, and I'll let you explain them. We were interested in susceptibility to fraud. So if older people focus on the good and don't pay much attention to the bad, might they be more susceptible to fraud? We used Natalie Denberg's fake ads in the study, and we induced, using the mid-task, getting people to be happy or sad, we induced excitement or anger. So you're winning money and all of a sudden you lose it all, you're winning money, and then all of a sudden you get a big bonus, a big win, and we reliably induce positive emotions and negative emotions. And what we find, then we ask them if they're interested in these products, and younger adults are not affected by these different conditions, and older people are more likely to be interested in purchasing that product, whether they're angry or excited. We had hypothesized this would be really specific to positive emotion, but either way, we're seeing increases in this, and it's concerning. So I will now actually stop. And thank you all very much for being here. I look forward to the rest of the day.